when a battered golden retriever lay chained and forgotten in the middle of a raging snowstorm. He had no idea his life was about to change forever. What began as another cold, hopeless night would soon transform into a desperate fight for survival, and an act of compassion that would spark a bond no one could have expected. The storm howled like a wild animal, ripping through the empty streets with a ferocity that made even the bravest souls retreat indoors. Snow whipped through the air, blurring the edges of houses and trees, covering everything in a thick, unrelenting blanket of white. But in one forgotten yard, barely visible through the swirling chaos, a golden retriever lay motionless, half buried in snowdrifts that seemed determined to claim him entirely. His body was too thin, his ribs jutting out sharply under his dull, matted coat. A rusted chain bound him tightly to a decaying wooden post, the links cutting cruelly into his neck. The storm's icy fingers tugged at the fur on his emaciated frame, and his shallow breaths grew weaker with each passing moment. His world had been reduced to cold, pain, and silence. The dog no longer shivered. Even his body had given up its fight against the freezing temperatures. His eyes, half closed and lifeless, gazed blankly at the snow piling up around him. Then, through the roar of the storm, there came the faintest sound, boots crunching against ice. A figure emerged from the haze, the beam of a flashlight piercing through the whiteout. Harper, bundled tightly in her winter coat, scarf, and gloves, had been walking home after her shift at the animal clinic when she saw the broken-down fence. Something about the scene made her stop, her gut twisting with an unexplainable unease. She swept her flashlight across the yard, and that's when she saw him. Her breath caught in her throat. "Oh my God," she whispered, stepping closer despite the sting of the icy wind biting at her face. The dog looked like a ghost of himself, a shadow of what he once must have been. Her heart clenched as she crouched by the fence, the snow seeping through her jeans. "Hey, buddy," she called softly, her voice trembling with urgency. "Can you hear me?" The golden retriever stirred faintly, his head lifting just enough for her to see his hollow, sunken eyes. He let out a weak whimper, so faint she wasn't even sure she'd heard it. Then his head sank back into the snow, as though even the effort of looking at her had drained him completely. "No, no, no," Harper whispered, her hands gripping the frozen wood of the fence. Her flashlight beam swept the yard again, illuminating the overturned water bowl, now filled with ice, and an empty food dish buried beneath a fresh layer of snow. The anger that flared in her chest was immediate and visceral. How could anyone let this happen? But there was no time for anger. She pulled out her phone, her frozen fingers fumbling with the screen as she snapped a picture of the dog. She quickly texted it to her mentor at the clinic. "Found a golden retriever. Chained. Starving. Freezing. What do I do?" The reply came almost instantly. "Call animal control right away. If it's safe, try to warm him up. He doesn't have much time." Harper shoved her phone back into her pocket, her hands trembling from both the cold and the urgency. "I'll be back," she said to the dog, her voice thick with emotion. "Hold on. Okay, just hold on." She sprinted through the blizzard, slipping on patches of ice as she made her way back to her apartment 2 blocks away. Inside, she threw open her closet, grabbing an old blanket and the thermos of warm water she'd made earlier that evening. Every second felt like an eternity as she hurried back to the yard, her breath coming in visible gasps against the freezing air. When she returned, the retriever hadn't moved. Snow had begun to settle on his fur, and Harper's stomach twisted at the sight. She knelt by the fence, her gloves stiff with ice as she slid the thermos through a gap in the slats. "Here," she said softly, unscrewing the lid and tilting it toward him. "It's warm. Please drink." The dog sniffed weakly, his body barely moving, before his tongue flicked out to lap at the water. Harper bit her lip, tears pricking at her eyes as she watched him. "That's it," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You're so strong. Just a little more." Carefully, She unfolded the blanket and slid it over the dog's trembling frame. First, he flinched, his instincts kicking in despite his exhaustion. But Harper didn't pull away. She stayed still, her voice gentle and reassuring. "It's okay," she murmured. "I'm not going to hurt you. You're safe now." Minutes felt like hours as Harper stayed by his side, shielding him from the worst of the wind with her own body. The storm raged on around them, but she didn't care. This dog needed her, and she wasn't going to leave him. The faint sound of an engine broke through the howling wind, and Harper turned to see the glowing headlights of an animal control truck cutting through the snow. Relief flooded through her, and she stood, waving her arms to guide the truck toward the yard. "He's over here," she called, her voice barely audible over the storm. The officer stepped out, his breath fogging in the freezing air. He carried bolt cutters and wore a look of grim determination. As he approached the fence, his eyes landed on the retriever, and his expression softened. "Poor guy," he muttered, crouching down. "Let's get you out of here." Harper watched, her heart pounding, as the officer carefully cut the chain binding the dog to the post. The retriever didn't resist as he was gently lifted into the officer's arms, his frail body disappearing into the folds of the blanket Harper had given him. "You're safe now," Harper whispered, tears streaming down her face as she watched the officer carry the dog to the truck. "You're going to be okay." As the truck disappeared into the swirling snow, Harper stood there for a moment longer, the wind whipping at her coat. Despite the cold, a flicker of warmth blossomed in her chest. She had done something good, something that mattered. Before we continue with this incredible story of survival and hope, I want to connect with you, my amazing viewers. Where are you watching from? Drop your country's flag in the comments below. And if you've ever believed in the unshakable bond between humans and animals, hit that like button because what happens next will restore your faith in second chances. The storm had passed by the time the animal control truck reached the shelter, leaving behind a quiet stillness that seemed to blanket the world. The golden retriever, wrapped tightly in the blanket Harper had given him, lay motionless in the back of the truck. His shallow breathing was the only sign of life. The warmth of the vehicle was a stark contrast to the frigid yard where he had spent so many nights. As the officer carried him inside, the shelter staff hurried to meet them, their faces etched with concern. "We'll take it from here," said Dr. Bennett, the head veterinarian, her voice calm but urgent. She gestured toward an examination table, where a team was already waiting with supplies. The room buzzed with quiet efficiency as the team worked to stabilize him. They moved quickly, cleaning the raw wounds on his neck and starting 4 fluids to combat dehydration. Each step revealed more of the neglect he had endured: his emaciated frame, the sores on his paws from pacing on frozen ground, and the infections that had taken hold around the edges of his wounds. Dr. Bennett leaned over him, her hands gentle as she examined his frail body. "He's critical, but he's a fighter," she murmured. "We'll do everything we can." Meanwhile, Harper paced in the waiting area, her mind racing with a mix of hope and fear. Every minute felt like an hour, and the image of the retriever's lifeless eyes haunted her. She hadn't even known his name, yet she felt an overwhelming connection to him, as though fate had placed her on that street for a reason. Finally, Dr. Bennett emerged, her expression softening as she approached. "He made it through the initial stabilization," she said, "but he's not out of the woods yet. He'll need time and a lot of care." Relief washed over Harper, and she exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Can I see him?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Bennett hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Just for a few minutes. He's still very weak." Harper followed her into the quiet recovery room, where the golden retriever lay on a soft blanket, his body wrapped in bandages and his breathing steadier than before. His eyes were closed, but his chest rose and fell rhythmically, a small but powerful sign of life. Harper knelt beside him, her hand hovering hesitantly above his fur. "Hey there," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "It's me. Remember?" As if in response. His tail moved the faintest wag, almost imperceptible, but enough to bring tears streaming down Harper's face. She rested her hand gently on his head, her fingers brushing against his soft, matted fur. "You're so brave," she said, her voice cracking. "We're going to get you through this." The shelter staff named him Hudson, a name meant to evoke strength and resilience. For the next few days, Harper visited him every chance she got. Each visit was a mix of heartbreak and hope as she watched him fight to recover. Hudson's progress was slow, his body was weak, and the toll of neglect had left scars that would take time to heal, but there were glimmers of improvement. His eyes, once dull and lifeless, began to brighten, and he started responding to the gentle words and touches of the staff. Harper became his constant. She brought small treats, sat by his side for hours, and read to him from her favorite books. Her presence seemed to calm him, and the bond between them grew stronger with each passing day. One morning, as she entered the recovery room, Hudson surprised her. He lifted his head, a movement that had seemed impossible just days before, and looked directly at her. His tail wagged, stronger this time, and his eyes met hers with a spark of recognition. "You're amazing," Harper said, her voice filled with awe. She knelt beside him, her hand resting gently on his back. "You're going to be okay. I know it." The shelter staff marveled at the connection between them. "He's different when you're here," Dr. Bennett observed one afternoon. "It's like he knows he's safe when you're around." Hudson's progress accelerated in the weeks that followed. He began standing on his own, taking hesitant steps around the shelter with Harper by his side. His fur, once dull and matted, started to regain its golden sheen, and the deep wounds around his neck began to heal, though faint scars remained as a testament to his resilience. Through it all, Harper couldn't shake the feeling that Hudson had chosen her as much as she had chosen him. He trusted her in a way that he didn't trust anyone else, and the thought of him leaving the shelter without her filled her with a quiet dread. The first rays of morning sunlight filtered through the shelter windows, casting a warm glow on Hudson's recovery room. He was awake, his golden eyes following Harper as she entered with a familiar smile and a bag of his favorite treats. His tail thumped softly against the blanket, a steady rhythm that seemed to echo the bond growing between them. "Good morning, buddy," Harper said, crouching beside him. She reached out, her fingers brushing through his now soft and growing coat. He leaned into her touch, his eyes closing as if savoring the warmth of her presence. Moments like these had become the highlight of her day, a solace that reminded her why she had chosen to devote her life to helping animals. But today, the air in the shelter felt different, tinged with a sense of inevitability. Harper had overheard the staff discussing Hudson's adoption profile. He had made remarkable progress, and inquiries were already coming in. The thought sent a pang through her chest. Was she ready to let him go? Could anyone else care for him the way she did? Later that afternoon, as Hudson took slow but confident steps around the shelter's courtyard, Harper watched him with a mixture of pride and sadness. Each step he took was a testament to his resilience, to the fight he had waged against the neglect and pain that had once defined his life. But with every step, the looming question grew louder in her mind. What happens next? As if sensing her unease, Dr. Bennett approached, her expression thoughtful. "He's come so far," she said, watching Hudson sniff a patch of grass with curiosity. "I think he's ready to find his forever home." Harper hesitated, her heart pounding. "Yeah," she said softly, though the word felt hollow. She glanced at Hudson, his tail wagging as he turned to look at her. His eyes, bright and full of trust, seemed to ask a question of their own. "Are you leaving me?" Dr. Bennett placed a hand on Harper's shoulder. "You know, sometimes forever homes find themselves." The words lingered in Harper's mind as she drove home that evening. Hudson had become a part of her life in ways she hadn't expected. He wasn't just a dog she had helped rescue. He was a symbol of hope, of the unbreakable bond between human and animal. Letting him go felt like severing a piece of her own heart. That night, Harper sat in her small apartment, surrounded by the silence that had once felt comforting but now seemed hollow. She thought of Hudson lying alone in the shelter, of his quiet strength and the way his eyes lit up whenever she entered the room. Could she give him the life he deserved? Would bringing him home be what was best for him, or for her? The next morning, Harper returned to the shelter with a decision she hadn't realized she'd already made. As she entered Hudson's room, he greeted her with a tail wag that was stronger than ever, and she couldn't help but smile. She knelt beside him, her hand resting on his back. "Hudson," she said softly, her voice steady despite the emotions swirling within her. "How do you feel about coming home with me?" His ears perked up at the sound of her voice, and his tail thumped against the floor in response. Harper laughed through the tears that welled in her eyes, leaning down to press her forehead gently against his. In that moment, she knew this wasn't just her choice. It was theirs. The adoption process was seamless, as though the shelter staff had been expecting it all along. Dr. Bennett handed Harper the paperwork with a knowing smile. "You're going to be great for each other," she said. That afternoon, Harper opened the door to her apartment with Hudson at her side. His paws hesitated on the threshold, his nose twitching as he sniffed the unfamiliar space. Harper knelt beside him, giving his leash a reassuring tug. "It's okay," she said. "This is your home now." Hudson stepped inside, his movements cautious but curious. His eyes scanned the room, taking in the soft bed Harper had placed in the corner, the bowls of food and water waiting for him in the kitchen, and the toys scattered across the floor. He padded over to the bed, sniffed it hesitantly, then lay down with a contented sigh. Harper watched him, her heart swelling with pride and love. She sat on the floor beside him, running her fingers through his fur. "You've come so far," she whispered, "and this is just the beginning." As the day faded into evening, Harper lit a fire in the small fireplace, the warmth filling the room as snow began to fall outside the window. Hudson lay by her side, his head resting on her lap, his eyes closing with a peace she had never seen before. But their journey wasn't over. What challenges would they face as Hudson adjusted to his new life? And what unexpected moments would deepen the bond between them? Only time would tell. But Harper knew one thing for certain: Hudson was home, and neither of them would ever feel alone again. The cold night air was crisp and quiet, save for the soft crunch of snow beneath Harper's boots. Hudson walked beside her, his leash slack in her hand, his golden fur gleaming under the faint light of the street lamps. Their evening walks had become a cherished ritual, a chance for both of them to breathe and connect after the long days. But tonight was different. As they turned a corner, a loud, sudden bang shattered the calm. Car backfired down the street, the sharp noise slicing through the stillness. Hudson froze, his ears flattening against his head, his body trembling. Before Harper could soothe him, he bolted, yanking the leash from her hand and disappearing into the snowy haze. "Hudson!" Harper screamed, her heart racing as she ran after him. Snow whipped against her face, her breaths coming in ragged gasps. The golden retriever was a blur against the white, darting frantically between parked cars and down an alley. Panic clawed at Harper's chest. She couldn't lose him, not after everything they had been through. The thought of him alone, scared, and vulnerable in the cold was unbearable. She pushed herself harder, calling his name into the night, her voice echoing off the silent buildings. Finally, in a dimly lit alley, she saw him. Hudson was crouched behind a dumpster, his body pressed against the icy wall, trembling uncontrollably. His eyes were wide with fear, his breath coming in short, shallow bursts. Harper approached slowly, her hands trembling. "Hudson," she said softly, her voice breaking. "It's okay. It's me. I'm here." For a moment, he didn't move. Then, his eyes flicked to hers, and a spark of recognition replaced the fear. Harper dropped to her knees in the snow, her arms outstretched. "Come here, buddy," she whispered. Hudson hesitated, his body still shaking. But then, with tentative steps, he moved toward her, collapsing into her arms. Harper wrapped him in her embrace, her tears mingling with the snowflakes that clung to her face. "You're okay," she murmured, her voice thick with emotion. "I've got you." The walk home was slow, Harper keeping a steady hand on Hudson's leash, her other arm draped protectively around him. By the time they reached her apartment, her legs were numb, and her hands were shaking, but relief coursed through her. That night, Hudson lay curled up by the fire, his head resting on Harper's lap. She stroked his fur gently, her mind racing with thoughts of what had triggered his panic and how deeply his past still haunted him. The next morning, Harper noticed something was wrong. Hudson, usually eager for his breakfast, barely touched his food. He seemed lethargic, his movements slow and his eyes dull. A knot of worry formed in Harper's stomach as she called Dr. Bennett. "He's not himself," Harper explained over the phone, her voice filled with concern. "He's weak, and he won't eat. Bring him in," Dr. Bennett replied. "It could be exhaustion from last night, but let's make sure it's nothing more serious." At the clinic, Dr. Bennett ran tests and examined Hudson carefully. Her face was grave as she turned to Harper. "His immune system is still fragile," she said. "The stress and cold likely triggered a setback. He needs rest, warmth, and constant care." Harper nodded, her jaw tight with determination. "Whatever he needs, I'll do it." For the next few days, Harper became Hudson's full-time nurse. She hand-fed him small meals, kept him wrapped in blankets, and lay beside him on the floor during sleepless nights. Each time his eyes met hers, she whispered words of encouragement, her voice steady despite the tears she fought to hold back. "You're strong," she told him, running her fingers gently along his back. "We've come so far. Don't give up on me now." Then, just as things seemed to be improving, a fierce snowstorm hit the town. The power went out, plunging Harper's apartment into darkness and cold. She quickly lit candles and wrapped Hudson in every blanket she could find. But the temperature continued to drop. Hudson's shivering grew worse, his body unable to fight against the chill. Harper knew she couldn't wait for the storm to pass. She had to get him to the clinic, where there was backup power and heat. Bundling Hudson in her thickest coat, Harper lifted him into her arms. The storm raged outside, snow and wind battering against her as she stepped into the night. Each step was a struggle, the icy ground slick beneath her boots. But she pressed on, her arms tightening around Hudson's frail body. "You're going to be okay," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. "Just hold on." By the time she reached the clinic, her face was numb, and her legs felt like lead. But relief flooded her as she stepped into the warm, brightly lit space. The staff moved quickly, taking Hudson from her arms and placing him on a heated table. Harper collapsed into a chair, her hands trembling as she watched Dr. Bennett work. Minutes felt like hours as the team stabilized Hudson, giving him fluids and wrapping him in thermal blankets. Finally, Dr. Bennett turned to Harper, a small smile on her face. "He's going to be okay. You got him here just in time." Tears spilled down Harper's cheeks as she leaned against the wall, her heart pounding with relief. She approached Hudson, who lay on the table, his eyes half open but filled with a quiet trust. "You scared me," she said softly, brushing a hand over his fur. "But we made it." Hudson's tail moved, just a small wag, but enough to make Harper laugh through her tears. In that moment, she knew their bond had grown even stronger, forged in the trials they had faced together. But what challenges still lay ahead? Could Hudson fully leave his past behind and embrace the life Harper had fought so hard to give him? The answers were waiting in the days to come. But one thing was certain: they would face them together. The first rays of morning sunlight peeked through Harper's apartment window, casting a soft glow across the living room where Hudson lay curled up on his blanket. The storm had passed, leaving behind a serene stillness. Hudson's breathing was steady, his golden fur shimmering faintly in the light. Harper sat nearby with a cup of coffee in her hands, her eyes never leaving him. Last night had tested her in ways she hadn't anticipated. But the sight of Hudson safe and warm made every frozen step worthwhile. She reached down and gently scratched behind his ears. "Good morning, brave boy," she whispered. His tail gave a small thump against the floor in response. Hudson was recovering faster than Harper could have hoped. Over the next few days, his energy returned bit by bit. He began following Harper from room to room, his quiet companionship a constant reminder of how far they had come. Still, there were moments when his past lingered, a sudden noise that made him flinch, or a hesitation in his step when he approached a new space. One afternoon, Harper decided to take him to a nearby park. The snow glistened under the bright winter sun, and families bundled in coats played with their dogs among the trees. Hudson's leash hung loose in Harper's hand as they walked slowly along the path, his nose twitching at the crisp scents of pine and fresh snow. They came to a clearing where several dogs were bounding through the drifts, their barks echoing joyfully in the air. Hudson froze, his ears perking up as he watched them from a distance. Harper knelt beside him, her voice soft and encouraging. "It's okay, Hudson. They're just having fun. You can join them if you want." Hudson glanced at her, his golden eyes filled with uncertainty. Harper stayed by his side, giving him time. Slowly, he took a step forward, then another, until he reached the edge of the clearing. One of the dogs, a playful Labrador, approached with a wagging tail. Hudson stiffened but didn't back away. The Labrador barked softly and bounded into the snow, inviting Hudson to follow. For a moment, Hudson hesitated, his body tense. Then, as if a weight had been lifted, he lunged forward, his tail wagging furiously as he chased after the Labrador. Harper laughed, tears of pride welling in her eyes as she watched him run and play for the first time. The transformation was astounding. Hudson's joy was infectious, and Harper couldn't help but smile as she watched him weave through the snow, his golden coat catching the sunlight. It was a moment she would never forget. A moment when she realized Hudson wasn't just surviving anymore. He was living. That evening, back at home, Hudson lay at Harper's feet, his body warm and relaxed. She reached down and stroked his fur, her thoughts drifting to the journey they had taken together. Hudson had come into her life broken and scared, but he had shown her something extraordinary, how resilience could blossom in the face of adversity, and how love could mend even the deepest wounds. Harper's phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from Dr. Bennett, checking in on Hudson. Harper typed a quick reply. "He's doing amazing. Today he played in the snow for the first time. Thank you for everything." As she set her phone down, Harper looked at Hudson, who had lifted his head to watch her. She smiled and leaned closer. "You've changed everything. You know that?" she said softly. Hudson's tail thumped against the floor, his eyes filled with trust and gratitude. The challenges they had faced together had only strengthened their bond. Harper had saved Hudson, but in many ways, he had saved her too, reminding her of the power of compassion and the beauty of second chances. But the world was unpredictable, and Harper knew there would be more hurdles to overcome. How would their growing bond be tested next? And what new adventures would shape the rest of their journey together? For now, they had each other, and that was more than enough. Life with Hudson was becoming a rhythm of quiet joy and small victories. Yet, Harper knew his past still lingered in the shadows of his mind. One crisp afternoon, she decided to take Hudson on a hike through the snowy trails just outside town, hoping the fresh air and open space would bolster his confidence. The trail was serene, the snow crunching softly beneath their feet. Hudson stayed close to Harper, his leash taut in her hand. But as they rounded a bend, A man appeared from a distance, bundled in a heavy coat, his silhouette vaguely familiar. Hudson froze, his ears flattening, a low growl rumbling in his throat. "Hudson, it's okay," Harper said gently, kneeling beside him, but the golden retriever's body remained tense. His eyes locked on the stranger. Harper realized this wasn't just fear. This was a memory surfacing, one that Harper could only guess came from his past. The man passed without incident, and Harper spent the rest of the hike reassuring Hudson. It was a stark reminder that healing wasn't linear, but she promised herself she would stand by him through every step forward and every stumble back. A few weeks later, Harper decided to explore the woods near their favorite park, a quiet escape from the bustle of town. Snow had begun to melt, leaving patches of icy ground that glistened in the pale sunlight. Hudson trotted happily beside her, his tail wagging, his leash secured tightly in Harper's hand. But as they ventured deeper into the forest, the ground became uneven and slippery. Harper misstepped on an icy patch, and before she could steady herself, her foot slid out from under her. She tumbled down a small embankment, her ankle twisting painfully as she landed against a fallen tree. "Ah!" Harper cried out, clutching her ankle. The pain was sharp and immediate, and she quickly realized she couldn't stand. Above her, Hudson barked frantically, pacing at the top of the slope. "It's okay, boy," Harper called, trying to keep her voice steady despite the panic rising in her chest. "I'm okay," Hudson barked again. His eyes locked on her as if he understood her predicament. Then, to Harper's astonishment, he leapt down the embankment, his movements agile and determined. He landed beside her, sniffing her leg before looking up at her with an intensity she hadn't seen before. "Hudson," she said softly, her voice trembling, "I need help." Without hesitation, Hudson began to bark loudly, the sound echoing through the forest. Harper could only watch in awe as he climbed back up the slope and bolted down the trail, his leash trailing behind him. Minutes felt like hours as Harper waited, her fingers clutching her jacket to keep warm. Just as she began to lose hope, the sound of hurried footsteps reached her ears. Two hikers appeared at the top of the embankment, Hudson leading them with urgency in his stride. "Are you okay?" one of them called, sliding down to reach her. "I twisted my ankle," Harper replied, tears welling in her eyes as relief washed over her. As they helped her up, Hudson returned to her side, his tail wagging but his eyes full of concern. Harper wrapped her arms around him, burying her face in his fur. "You saved me," she whispered, her voice cracking. "You're my hero." The hikers helped Harper back to the trailhead, where she called for a ride to the clinic. Through it all, Hudson stayed by her side, his presence a steady reminder of the bond they shared, a bond that had now deepened in ways Harper could never have imagined. Months later, Harper stood in her backyard, the spring sun warming her face as she watched Hudson chase a butterfly across the freshly bloomed flowers. His golden coat gleamed in the light, his movements free and confident, a picture of resilience and joy. It was their one-year anniversary. 1 year since Harper had found Hudson chained and broken in the middle of that snowstorm. The memories of those dark days had faded, replaced by moments of love and laughter that had filled their life together. Harper crouched down as Hudson ran toward her, his plush toy clamped proudly in his jaws. "You're incredible. You know that?" she said, ruffling his fur as he leaned against her. "You've taught me so much about strength and love." Hudson wagged his tail, his eyes bright with trust and happiness. For Harper, he was more than a dog, he was family, a living testament to the power of second chances and the healing strength of love. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a golden glow over the yard, Harper knew their story was far from over. Together, they had reclaimed their lives, and whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them as a team. What an incredible journey, right? Hudson's story is a true testament to resilience, love, and the unbreakable bond between humans and animals. But now, I want to hear from you, my amazing viewers. What did you think about Hudson and Harper's incredible story? Did it touch your heart as much as it did mine? Drop a 2 in the comments if you loved the video and felt inspired, or a 7 if you think there's room for improvement. Your feedback means the world to me and helps me create even more powerful stories for you. And don't forget to share this story with your friends and family, because who doesn't need a little more hope and love in their lives? If you haven't already, make sure to hit that subscribe button and join us here at Tapestry of Worlds, where we weave together stories that connect us all. Together, let's keep spreading inspiration, one story at a time.